This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, Professor Nancy Sherman on Stoicism and the military.
People are looking for an alternative to religion often. It's a secular religion for some. It's got a lot of overlap because it comes out of the same time period as what some were raised on. They can get it in bite-sized portions. They don't have to show up somewhere on Sunday morning, Saturday morning, be part of some group. They can kind of do it at their desk. Louis XIV was a dancer, and he brought his ballet master out to the fields to teach them FSA, which is side-facing with your sword, and but also how to march across, a palace floor.
Nancy Sherman, welcome to Chatter, and thank you for joining me in person in the studio.
My pleasure, Shane.
It's
lovely.
I'm really excited to have this conversation. We are going to be talking today about Stoicism and the Stoics, which is a subject that I am relatively new to in the past few years. I've been reading about Stoicism, kind of hearing it on podcasts. I have a meditation practice, which we will get into meditation, where Stoicism has kind of played a role in this. But we're going to be talking as well about your work on studying the Stoics, and particularly with an application in the military and what military culture has to benefit from Stoicism. We'll be talking a lot about your book, Stoic Warriors, the ancient philosophy behind the military mind. What I wanted to start with, though, is some definitional matters, because when I first came to reading about the Stoics and Stoicism, I had, like I presume a lot of people do, I think a misimpression of what Stoicism meant. Like when you think of somebody as a Stoic, I think we have this impression that somebody is, they suck it up and they have a tough upper lip. And it just means that they're sort of a calm exterior, but maybe on the inside they're falling to pieces. What is Stoicism, and what do we mean when we say someone is a Stoic?
So that stiff upper lip, which I learned only a few years back, is actually an American phrase. Around the same time you might have thought it was a Victorian English phrase. That's often described as with a little s. So a popularized notion of stolid and sturdy, as you were saying, unflappable. Whatever else is happening inside, the exterior is resilience. Queen Elizabeth, after Philip's death, barely a tear shed, but maybe Westminster Abbey private moment showed her with a tear. But the Stoics, with the capital S, and there are many of them, so unlike Aristotle or Plato, this is a collection of individuals that span maybe from around 300 before the Common Era to 200 Common Era, so 400 or 500 years, a good chunk of time, Greek and Roman. And they, just to set them, so if there was a Socrates and a Plato and an Aristotle, the Stoics come next. They're often called Hellenists, the Hellenization or the Grecization of the ancient world. And they, in some ways, are reacting to Aristotle and Aristotle's ethics, but they may not have read him. The thought is, though, that we can control much more than we think we can. We can be masters of our fate, as this great Invictus poem goes. We can minimize the risks and hazards and vulnerabilities that come with dependence or interaction with the external world. It doesn't mean you retreat fully, but you do your best to create armor through a lot of training. Some of it's emotion training. Some of it is meditation, a certain kind of meditation. Not really in the Buddhist style. This is much talkier. This is, after all, it's kind of Greek and Roman philosophy. It's about words.
They like to talk it out, yeah.
And not about silence. So it's very discursive.
Okay.
But the idea is that you can try to prepare and anticipate for the unexpected. That's kind of paradoxical, but the idea is that there's more that you can do to anticipate the future. dwell in the future, says Cicero. So he's not really a Stoic, but he's a transmitter of Stoic texts to the Latin-speaking world. But others have this idea that if you can somehow rehearse evil or bad, it's not really evil in the sense of vice, but bad things that could happen.
Kind of imagine the worst that could happen.
Yeah, worst possible outcomes, and try to arm yourself against worst possible outcomes. So it is a way of minimizing risk. Now, of course, you can't do that. I mean, many people who lived in Asheville, North Carolina 2 days ago weren't buying oceanfront property that could be swept away in the way that houses get swept away in Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard. They're inland, is my understanding. But yet, they saw floods that were of biblical proportion.
Right.
It would be hard to prepare for that, and who knows if insurance companies prepared for it either.
That's a separate
which
question.
is, yeah. So that means they're facing tragedy. For most of us, you would be facing horrific tragedies. People say, I don't even know when to begin to cry as they try to even get on cell phone service in a mobile unit. So the Stoics not only think you can sort of premeditate about the future, anticipate these bads, but you can also tamp down your emotions. And that's maybe what many people find most interesting, that somehow, Seneca was living in an age of Nero. He was Nero's minister, spin doctor, speechwriter, tutor, everything. And he was trying to teach people how to calm your jets, cool your jets a little bit, calm down. This is a raging young emperor. Show some mercy, but he has a wonderful tract, a treatise on anger, De Ira, and it's very much about ways of catching that first moment of anger. It's called a proto-emotion. You kind of feel it coming on, and then you try to to nip it in the bud.
Yeah.
Before it blossoms or whatever, takes you down with it.
Sure.
And, maybe it's a little bit like our modern day CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, that you think about scenarios that would get you down. You rehearse what your affective and behavioral response would be, and you practice that.
Yeah.
And that's very useful. Many people find that very useful. It does leave open the possibility, well, how spontaneous can you be? And what about the good emotions? They could send you over on a roller coaster as well. Jump for joy, falling in love, all these sorts of things catch you by surprise. And we certainly know about depression and anxiety and all the, I've worked so much with individuals who've come out of traumatic situations, feeling the trauma for the better parts of their lives, young lives, but it will go on and on and on. And so, is it a foolproof method? No. I think some of its appeal, and this does bother me, is that there's sound bites. Someone like Epictetus can give you a one-line zinger. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it shows up on Ryan Holiday's daily feed.
We're 3 minutes in and already the Ryan Holiday. Ryan Holiday is a podcaster and writer who has popularized Stoicism quite a lot and brought it to a mass audience.
Right. And I think he needed it.
Yeah.
At some point.
Yes, he talks about it in his own life.
Yes,
and it's
he
helping
had a
him.
complicated, interface.
But it is kind of broken down, a lot of it, to aphorisms. And it kind of like these quotes that are meant to sort of contain all of the wisdom in a chunk. And you're right. There's a popularization, I think, of the philosophy that has led to that kind of inspirational quote genre.
It is. Yeah. That's exactly right. It is inspirational quote. Harder to get some inspirational quotes out of Aristotle. Even Plato, Socrates, I know that I don't know, that kind of thing. Yeah. That's pretty useful.
I've heard it describe Stoicism, and tell me if this is too pat, that one of the insights of Stoicism is that you cannot control events, but you can control how you respond to them.
Sure. The attitude is what you can control, but not the external world. So it's your reaction.
Yeah.
But it's also how you set up there's no external event that is just external. We see through eyes, we construe, we have bias, implicit or otherwise. They do think that as you see things, you may be able to also train your response time, so you slow it down. Hit the pause button a little bit. Am I seeing this through prejudiced eyes? Let me try to correct it. And that's, I think, useful, sort of a lesson in that, just like nip the emotion in the bud before it comes on full steam. Similarly, if I'm construing things and I may get a tweak inside me that maybe that's not the fairest estimate of what I'm seeing, then you could kind of hit a pause button a little bit and rethink a little bit how you construe. That's a little bit like rational or cognitive emotive behavior theory. It comes by different names. The most popular, I guess, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Reframing. And they can give you some of that. Now, that was also in Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle was an early cognitivist as an emotion theorist, but he doesn't popularize it in the same way. He does use it for teaching orators and rhetoricians. You want to stimulate your audience to feel this or that. Well, how would you do it? Make them think that the guy who they're arguing against in the assembly got it all wrong, and get them in the mood for figuring out or seeing that defendant or plaintiff got it all wrong, and go from there. And so it's a sort of a similar way of setting up your emotions.
Did the Stoics think of emotions in the way that we did? I mean, for instance, did they conceive of past traumas affecting how you see the world, or injuries that were done, to your mind, or maybe they would say to your soul, as affecting the way you behave now?
Great question. They certainly are living in traumatic times. Seneca himself has to commit suicide, and many people are subjects of forced suicide, as it's called, enforced suicide.
Which they might have imagined if they were practicing Stoicism.
Exactly.
Spend time thinking about how you would die.
Exactly. Or how you will prepare for death.
Right. How to prepare for it. Yeah.
How to prepare for mortality. That is one of the themes.
Yeah.
And so in a certain way, they're going down that route. They know these are really stormy times. I mean, there's also, for example, during Marcus Aurelius' time, he's another practitioner and a very popular person to read. Jim Maddox, says I always carry Marcus Aurelius in my knapsack, whatever you want to call it. When I go down range, and he finds it inspiring. And someone like Marcus, so emperor, 8 years at least on the Danube during the Germanic campaigns, there was Antonine plague. It was everywhere. It was their pestilence, their pandemic, without any meds. And so people are dying. He's probably sick with it. And so, there's physical injury and psychological injury, and who's really, sort of think of Henry VIII's court, who wants me, will Sir Thomas More really survive, or maybe not. I'm thinking of Wolf Hall.
Sure, yeah.
Will Thomas Cromwell make it through? We don't really know. Yeah. So there's a lot of intrigue, and with political intrigue, and with political intrigue comes very scary times, as well as all the wars. And if the Civil War was bad for us in terms of what you saw on the battlefield and how people bled to death, you can only imagine what it would have been like in Roman times.
And they're trying, the Stoics, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, the aim of it, at least an aim of Stoicism, is to try to arrive at tranquility or equanimity, right? So they clearly are trying to, these bad things that are happening around them, they want to equip themselves to arrive at a place where they can deal with them and not be undone by them.
Exactly. It's about strengthening your psyche to face the slings and arrows of fortune.
Right.
And, the question is, how much do you mitigate risk psychologically and avoid numbing yourself? That's always an issue, right? being numb to horror, being numb to grief is really a problem. So Cicero, who's not a practicing Stoic but very intrigued, he loses his daughter, Tullia, in childbirth. She was a beloved daughter. I think her death was very unexpected. And he doesn't know how to deal with it. And he goes into the hills outside Rome, the Tusculan hills, and he holds himself up for about 8 months or so. And he goes to a friend's library, and he tries to read everything he possibly can, including Stoic books that are written at the time, so Greek books. And he says this, about grief. He's trying to overcome his grief. He wants to get back to the forum. Julius Caesar is wondering, where are you? And ready to send the henchmen out. And he figures, well, the lesson of saying her death or a death that happens to me is nothing. Maybe that's fine when you're not in the height of grief, but it's no remedy now.
Yeah.
And so he sort of wrestles with its inhumanity at points. And I think that is the real risk, that you can so protect yourself. This is what I worry about with soldiers, that they're trained to be suck it up and truck on. And they don't know when to let it down. And when they try to let it down, it won't come out. And they bottle it up for a half a century or more.
Well, that's a good segue into talking about your work on Stoicism and the military. And, in the introduction to your book, I think it's in the introduction, you write about, I guess, kind of how you first became involved with the military on this question around Stoicism and ethics. And you write about a Navy chaplain that invited you to brainstorm with the top brass about moral remediation after about 133 midshipmen had been implicated in a cheating scandal. So talk a little bit about that story and how that then gets you into this professional experience with the military where you start talking about ethics and the Stoics.
So this was a most unexpected occasion mid-career for me.
Had you been teaching Stoicism and philosophy?
Well, I taught for years. I taught an intro ethics course at Yale for years, and I taught intro ethics at Georgetown. It's just bread and butter course for undergraduates. Okay. They figured I knew something about this, and they called me in. And I'm a child of the Vietnam era, you might say. So my experience with the military, other than my father's generation, World War II, was Vietnam. And here I get to the Naval Academy, and there are Vietnam-era colonels, admirals, generals. I mean, I was on the other side during this war, and they were in the Mekong Delta, and either as fighter pilots in some cases, or as, the superintendent, Larson, Admiral Dick Larson, he brought me on, and he was head of the Pacific. He was brought out of retirement, but he was the whole commander-in-chief of the Pacific. But during his time in Vietnam, he was a submariner. So I thought, this is going to be a hard one for me.
Culturally, just
culturally dissonant.
Spectrum,
Yes, my father thought it was quite remarkable, but he was a medic during World War II, treating in Glasgow or on the Clyde soldiers coming back from Normandy. So he had seen horrible stuff, and he wouldn't talk much about it.
Right.
But he thought, maybe I'll start talking a little bit. It was very revealing in that regard. But here I am. The first question was, have you ever taught ethics before? I said, well, day in and day out.
Yeah, all the time.
What about military ethics? Well, I hadn't. I knew Just and Unjust Wars, Michael Walzer's very famous book. Okay. He was a teacher. And they said, well, we have 133 midshipmen who've cheated on or implicated in a cheating scandal. They compromised an exam. They broke into a professor's office.
Wow.
This is big.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. And then there was a cover-up by the soup at the time, a guy named Lynch. I think his name is Lynch, who was himself had been a footballer. And so there were 5 football folks involved, and he was trying to protect them. It was awful, but because we're in Washington, or the academy is close to Washington, the inspector general, got involved, and this became a cause célèbre. And I didn't quite know where to begin, but we did a kind of, you might say, remedial summer ethics course. It had lecture components, but also they were writing journals about.
This is teaching the midshipmen because they must have been aware of the scandal.
133, the ones that had been implicated.
Oh, you're teaching
I was
them.
already remediating. And I thought the word remediation, I'm not quite sure. I've never remediated.
Sounds like you're the correctional officer.
I never remediated anyone, even our children. So I thought, that's interesting. I've never had that practical outcome.
Yeah.
So, try it. So, and then the other thing was that they were going to do also social work. Some would work in the city, in Annapolis or Baltimore to get out in the city and help out. All that seemed to make sense, but I didn't quite know what to do about the standard ethics part. So we just taught a version of what I typically teach, which Kantian ethics, Aristotelian ethics, and a fair bit of stuff on just war and just ethics, that sort of stuff. The trolley problem about collateral incidents, collateral damage. And the officers who, as I say, were these admirals and generals and, White House fellows that were now very high-ranking naval officers, their jaws dropped. They loved this stuff, and they, many of them are trained as engineers. They didn't get that kind of education, and so they became my TAs in later versions of the course, where we rolled it out for the whole second-year class. They're called youngsters. Because it was just viewed as a mandatory course now. We were going to institute it as mandatory ethics across the board for all second-year students.
And they just hadn't taught it to them before?
In bits and pieces.
Okay, but not in a
systematic or comprehensive way. Yeah. So that was fascinating. I always say that I got more of an education than they did in many ways because I became very close with students. But what was bizarre was when we hit Stoicism, which was a bit late in the course, it wasn't historical, it was thematic. The ship arrived. This was their philosophy.
Wow, okay.
And why was it their philosophy? Because one of their own, Jim Stockdale, Admiral James Bond Stockdale, vice president candidate under Perot, Ross Perot. Not a great moment for him. For Stockdale, that is, or Perot for that matter.
Famous debate where he says, "Why am I here?"
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wandering off. He might have had some bit of amnesia at that point. But at any rate, he had been the longest serving POW and head of the chain of command. Under him was John McCain. And so John McCain's a Naval Academy graduate. The anchor, as they say. He was at the bottom of his class. But an admiral's son. And he honorably said, I won't get out of turn. I won't leave prison. It's usually first in, first out.
Right, because I think that his captors wanted to make him kind of a PR element, and he wouldn't.
Absolutely, wouldn't comply.
Yeah.
So they knew a little bit about Stockdale. In Love and War, he wrote with Sybil, his wife. And it was Epictetus that turned them onto Stoicism. It was easy. It was, as you say, sort of epigrammatic, wisdom philosophy. You can quote it. And that idea of I can be in charge of some things, but some things I can't. Can I get home in time for my wedding when, the ship is still out at sea and there's no way we're going to get back on June 15th? Yep. Forget it. So let it go. This idea of letting it go.
Yeah.
Being in charge of what you can be in charge of. And you're always trying to expand the perimeter of your control, but at a certain point you hit buffers, and that's that.
Did they know Stockdale to be a practitioner of Stoicism?
Some, but not all. Some had served in Vietnam.
Okay.
And so they knew him as their POW.
Because he's kind of one of the more famous, if we can call it that, practitioners.
Yeah, and he had been a head of Naval War College, was teaching there, and maybe, And
it really got him through his captivity.
Well, he had memorized it. And later on, So I thought, this is interesting. I never, Stoicism wasn't taught much as the bread and butter ancient philosophy course when I was a graduate student because the texts are hard to come by. They're bitty and fragmented. It's not like reading the whole of Aristotle's Corpus or something like that.
Yeah.
And they weren't well translated. It would be very hard to teach a course because there weren't fragments that were translated easily. So we didn't really do it. And it was not thought as, the popular stuff wasn't thought of as very serious. But the other stuff was thought of as too hard to even figure out what to do with. But he had been given Epictetus, this is Stockdale now, as a farewell gift by the chair of the department at Stanford, who he wandered into philosophy out of foreign relations or something like that because he found it more interesting. And he said, take this, you might find it useful. And his response was, what would a martini-drinking, golf-playing naval aviator want with a book like that? And then he memorized it in those long nights in the Ticonderoga, his USS Ticonderoga. Amazing. And when he got shot down, 1965, he said, this is James Bond Stockdale 007, leaving behind the world of technology, entering the world of Epictetus. The students kind of knew that. Yeah. He was a folk hero.
Yeah.
And as a result, getting close to that work was very moving. So it made me think. I had clinical training, psychotherapeutic clinical training, and I started thinking, is this a blessing or a curse? I really worried hard. I didn't want to arm students with some philosophy that was going to numb them to the world and numb them to trauma they were likely to suffer.
Yeah.
And I also wanted them to have coping skills. Mm-hmm. And so I really worried hard. And, I framed it in Stoic Warriors, which is a book that came out of those years, The Blessings and Curses of Stoicism. And that's how that kind of book came to be. And it was a more complicated story than many. And then the more recent book on Stoicism is Stoic Wisdom, ancient philosophy behind whatever it's called, ancient lessons in modern resilience. Useful to know the subtitle of your own work.
It's easy to forget, too.
And that was in part because I was on so many podcasts and stuff where the message of Stoicism was about self-help. What can you do to strengthen your ego so that, again, you can endure all this stuff? And as someone who really thinks of a classroom as a support place and communities as support institutions and, it takes a village. It's just not just about you and your inner strength. It's about who can help you when you need help.
Which sounds like that would resonate very much with somebody serving in the military. I mean,
yes.
Because that is what it is really they're trying to tell her. You are a community. There's this, you read in the book about, it's a vertical culture in the sense that there's a chain of command, but there's a horizontal culture in that you have to care for your buddies and your fellow soldiers or sailors in the case of these
Absolutely.
Navy cadets.
Well, especially, the take care of your buddies, never leave a fallen comrade behind.
Yeah.
That is about us and not just me. And anyone that suffered a lot of trauma in the military sort of knows. The cases that were the hardest for me as I began to think about it in writing Untold War and after war, during the 20 years of war, and then even Stoic Wisdom, was, well, I'm alive and they're not. How did what I do to screw up there? How did I leave people behind? I could have prevented it. I should have and could have and would have. And, and I really wanted people to be able to handle that and not just tough it up.
Did the cadets resonate with this philosophy as well because they understood that it was kind of like an armor? It was going to equip them with how to deal with the extraordinary circumstances that they would likely face, whether they were in combat or not. I mean, you're going to be in a very stressful scenario, and these are also young people who are going on to be officers and leaders and have these enormous responsibilities.
So the midshipmen were 18 to 22. When I was there first, it was between the first Gulf War, and we hadn't yet had boots on the ground after Baghdad. And yeah, I mean, for them, the worst experience at the moment was the Naval Academy.
Right.
I mean, they had never seen anything,
Yeah.
Man, I left the Tupperware in my, on my locker, or I forgot to put my cover on as I'm walking around camp, around the yard,
right.
That's
Those were the worst things they could do.
Yeah.
When I think about Stoicism too, and you mentioned earlier about people in the military trying to sort of expand their zone of control, I think of Stoicism as, and maybe I'm looking at this the wrong way, about trying to realize how little you actually control. So how does that square with people in the military who are, trying to shape their environment? And we talk about combat operations as shaping the environment and areas of responsibility and those kinds of things.
It's a good question. The lower down you are on the totem pole, the less control you have. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, the more likely you are to be pissed off at your commanding officers or people that tell you, no, go do that because they're chasing ribbons and you're going to lose a buddy as you chase the ribbon for them. That was a big issue, ribbon chasing, which, this idea of getting your honors and medals because of some attack you took on in Fallujah or something like that. So, what really happened is when I started teaching, when I came back after 3 years of leave from Georgetown, I went back to Georgetown. It was about 2000, 99. And then 2 years later, we were at war.
Yep.
And my students started coming in who didn't yet have undergraduate educations, but were former Marines or something.
Yep.
There was a Marine spouse in the class who was following her husband who was in Fallujah. And it was at the height of things. So it's 05, 06, 07.
Yeah.
And I was getting a lot of students coming back from service. So many hadn't been, they weren't officers. They were enlisted, getting a first degree, so they didn't have first degrees. Some were actually did have first degrees. Some were master students that were in the security program, national security program of some sort or other. And that's how I wrote After War and Untold War. And, but I could tell just listening to those long interviews, these people are really hurting.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the closest thing they get to a clinician, and I'm not their clinician. And I would try to just, can I help you? I know these people in mental health. I have close contacts that work on moral injury, which is what we started calling it, which wasn't just PTSD. So it wasn't just a fear response, but it was a moral conscience response. They weren't responding to the threat of imminent danger, which is often what triggers PTSD, or you're remembering that danger where your life is threatened. But these are the dangers that come with, did I do the right thing? I compromised my values. I didn't take care of my troops. I let the guy in one case I remember so well, I stopped the van, he got out, he said, I need to go behind the rock and, have a bio break. Mm-hmm. And that was that. He got pulverized because there was a mine. And I should have said, clear the area, watch your footing, don't go there. Of course, he couldn't have known these things.
Right.
Couldn't have, but he said, they're my baby birds. He had grown up in the LA suburb, the barrio in LA. And he sort of said, these are my these are my baby birds. Yeah. He's all of, shall we say 20 at this point.
Amazing to have that level of responsibility.
Exactly. Yeah.
And did Stoicism offer some help to them? I mean,
it's hard to know. People are looking for an alternative to religion often.
Yeah.
It's a secular religion for some.
That's right, yeah.
And it's got a lot of overlap because it comes out of the same time period as what some were raised on, Christianity. And, it's 2 millennia old, and it's not surprising that they'll find resonances in it. So to that degree, sometimes yes. You never know what bits and pieces. Actually, some of the work about resilience and you needing a community came thinking about that couple, his wife was a woman who was at Georgetown at the time. When her husband chose to go into the Marines, and she was deciding between Stanford or Georgetown, and went to Georgetown, and she doing foreign service, school of foreign service, and she was his support. She would track as best she could, in the library, his movements. It's hard, it was hard to know where he was all the time, but it was clear. She took a bow and arrow away from him when he was no longer. She couldn't trust him with it. She made sure he got a care dog. She made sure he, got into a help condo that was in Virginia that was for veterans, that kind of thing. So you can't do it on your own. So did Stoicism help them? I'm not always sure. I think people have eclectic rag bags of help they carry around.
Right. You write in one part of the book in Stoic Warriors about this idea of decorum, and the idea of outward bearing in the military, standing straight, dressed neatly, creases in the shirt, addressing people as sir and ma'am. The typical idea of a soldier that we see. What's the connection there of Stoicism? Talk about that which you explore in the book.
Well, Seneca has this wonderful book called De Beneficis, which is on favors, doing favors, on benefiting other people. And a lot of it has to do with, or some of it at least, some of the more interesting bits have to do with how you show gratitude and how you show benefaction. What's on your face matters. Furrowed brow when you accept a gift you don't really like. Or, he says it's like giving stones in soup. And it kind of goes on like that. And Cicero, too, thinks of the outer part of emotion as on your face. And we do as well, of course, emotional expression.
And body language.
Yeah, all of that. And so I found it really fascinating. And it seems so at odds with Stoicism. Like if Stoicism was about stiff upper lip, well, this was being, at least you got to do the theatrics, show it. Now, the military they're not showing it. But on the other hand, they're trying to internalize the outer calm. They're marching and, they're on the parade grounds, and the eyes are going left and right to see if they're in line with everyone. But if you look at them straight on, I'm always amazed. There's no expression. You only imagine what's going on. So they've learned to tuck a lot inside while having a lot of the show, the right show on the outside.
Right.
It's got its problems, and sometimes it leaks. It leaks out on weekends when, they're on leave.
Right. And it all kind of explodes, that pent-up energy.
Exactly.
And do the Stoics trying to say, what's the Stoic response to somebody who's pent it all up and they're just wound up tight as a spring then?
So, I'm not sure exactly what it is. They think there are different levels of emotion. One is just sort of the spontaneous, you're just responding, and then you can kind of control it after a little bit of a burst. And then there's the ordinary emotions most of us have. And then there are these things called irrational emotions. They're the ones that are really highly cultivated. You don't, you have the joy at the right kinds of things, doing good deeds. You have pleasure at and similarly pleasure. Fear, not at a mouse, but at, real evil, fear of evil, that kind of thing, or fear that you might hang out with people that will take you down the wrong road. But there isn't any real good distress, they think, because if you're really the sage, the Stoic sage, you won't, the only thing that could really upset you would be vice, viciousness, evil, and you don't go in for that. So it's hard to know exactly how buttoned up you can be without paying the piper at some point or other for all that bottled up energy.
And what about emotions like anger and rage? I mean, these are things obviously we can associate with, combat and high stress environments, and we all experience anger and rage in our own environments too. But since we're talking about the military, does Stoicism regard anger as a wasted emotion? I mean, is it something that's standing in the way of tranquility and calm?
To some degree, I think they think, like Seneca is really the author of it, of the most profound book on anger, and that's that you give it an inch and it takes a mile, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It can't be. It's like a floodgate. It's very hard to control, and we would probably say that as well. Much more than grief, I think anger really has its own motor, and so no other rage does cities see than what anger can cause. Thinking about unruly rulers, and it's a lesson for our times. I think unchecked anger is extremely dangerous. Mm-hmm. The elections sort of are thinking about that at the moment. Mm-hmm. About what is the role of anger in politics? Can you channel it in the right way? Is it too dangerous to really let on? You want people to be able to show some kind of righteous indignation, but what is that about? It's certainly not being about just being dissed or dishonor of some sort. It's got to be more substantive. Mm-hmm. And so people talk about systemic injustices that were we not to feel anger about, we would be complicit somehow in them.
Right. And I think for the military, too, anger can be useful insofar as if you want to rouse your forces to believe that the cause that they're fighting for is just, right, that you want some kind of righteous indignation that's...
Well, Cicero is really interesting on this, and one of a friend who's a colonel said, someone I worked under would work up the anger to get us mobilized.
Yeah.
You think of, what is it, Full Metal Jack,
Yes.
Yeah. These horrible drill sergeants who put on a show in order to scare the living daylights out of people. And Cicero says something like that. The orator knows how to show anger when he really doesn't feel it.
Right. And there is really, that's such an interesting connection to the rhetoric of the Stoics and of that time, because so much of the military is theatrical. It's performance. It's the drill sergeant. It's the parade grounds. It's the sort of the order and the discipline, and we're going to follow these customs. I can see why some of this kind of resonates with people who are thinking that way in the ancient
absolutely.
world.
On the other hand, when you're out in the battle, and you're downrange, you really have to have a cool head.
Yeah, absolutely.
A very cool head. Otherwise, all hell will break loose.
Right. Then the confusion and the anger can get the better of you, right?
Yeah, or you're a pilot, and you're flying very low, and you see stuff, and you really want to be as circumspect as you can. But you may mistakenly identify a target, and it's a house with kids instead of the military unit you thought. And there it's not anger that blows up, but very delayed grief, or anger or rage at yourself.
I think we're used to now in modern war movies seeing this picture of the soldier as kind of battle-hardened to the point that, there's the trope of the new guy who shows up into the platoon and the old hardened guys are there and they're kind of glazed over, and it's just one thing. It's one day, nothing surprises them anymore. One day after the next, it's the same kind of thing because they've sort of the idea it's been almost like they've been beaten down. But it strikes me there's a Stoic approach there as well, in the sense that they just understand whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And all they can really do is take care of themselves and take care of the people around them.
Yeah, they definitely, they long gave up the idea this is an unjust war I'm fighting.
Yeah.
Well, the best I can do is know what the rules of engagement are,
right,
and make sure my guys know the rules of engagement.
Right.
Or if, I spend a lot of time thinking about sexual abuse on bases, and if they're seeing that stuff and they see how aggrieved women are and unable to do their jobs or even walk into the chow hall without, being a deer in the headlights, they have to be able to do something. And that is a case where they should get angry.
Yeah.
They should get angry at what their guys or their troops are doing to the women on base.
Yeah, because it seems like if you take Stoicism to its conclusion, maybe one might conclude, well, we can't do anything about anything, so therefore
It's
why
resignation.
try? Yeah, exactly. And it's
you
not,
really want to avoid resignation.
Yeah.
And it does it's a thin line. Resignation is, or that quietude of, shrug your shoulders.
What are you going to do?
Yeah. No, that would be horrid.
Yeah.
And so you want to be able to be as much of an agent as you can be, but not fully unravel when you've absolutely done your best and then tragedy sets in.
Yeah. I guess it makes me go back to my earlier kind of thought about Stoicism and ask if it was too pat, this idea that you can't control external circumstances, you can only control how you respond to them. But there are some things we can control, right? Like in the military, you can discipline someone who's abusing a fellow soldier. You can take the student who cheated on the exam and force him to go through a remediation process to see what he did that was wrong, right?
So in the case of what you can and can't control, sometimes you think the onus of control should still remain with the individual. This is often the case with women. They've been victimized. Well, this is an awful case. Someone was stalked that I know. And then, and there was the rumor mill about everyone was sleeping with her. And in addition to that, she goes to do her laundry and her bras and panties are missing. And she doesn't really want to write to her mom for a new supply because that would upset the mother. She doesn't know what to do. She reports it to her commanding officer, and he kind of snickers, like, what kind of offense is that? He's still part of the old frat boy kind of mentality.
Sure.
But she can't concentrate. She can't be a conscientious person. Or even worse, medical issues for women. Tampons smell in the Johnnies, that are out downrange. But how to dispose of them otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of issue of a commander being sensitive to issues that only he can change the environment.
Yeah.
But the individuals who are low down can't really change the environment. This is not the foot soldier who can really change the command culture.
Stoicism is useful for them, but
individually.
It might be a cop-out for the commander.
Yeah, a good way of putting it. Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah. And so you have to bring it up the chain of command and hope that when you bring it up the chain of command will do something.
Yeah.
But they don't always. I mean, one of the persons I worked closest with for 10 years or so was Ian Fishback. So he's a PhD from University of Michigan in philosophy and was a decorated soldier, a Green Beret, and he blew a whistle on torture that led to the McCain Amendment against torture in 2005, I think, a little bit around the same time of Abu Ghraib, but it happened independently.
Yep.
And for a good 2 years, just about 21 years or so, 21 months, he tried to bring it up the chain of command, but it wouldn't go anywhere. And finally, through a contact in D.C., he was able to bring it to John McCain's attention. And, here was someone who had been a POW, who knew about torture, who took it seriously. And so that led to the McCain Amendment against torture. That was a lot of persistence and bringing it up the chain of command, which is not something most of us have to deal with in civilian life. We have bosses, but it's not like you have to march vertically, one step at a time. He couldn't really do much, and being stymied was not good for his mental health. Mm-hmm. Because he was, anyone that blows a whistle is viewed as a betrayer.
Yeah.
Going against the team.
Right, selling somebody out.
Yeah, that sort of stuff.
How, to segue kind of into your work with working people with soldiers who've come home and are suffering from PTSD, what does Stoicism have to offer for people who are dealing with the physical and the mental wounds of serving in combat?
I'm not really sure. There aren't. If you think of it like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is probably the leading evidence-based psychotherapy on the block right now, it's similar to that. see if you can reconstrue the situation. Stoicism doesn't have the jazzed up virtual reality that many people who are dealing in trauma units, psychological trauma units, might put you through. I've been to places where you're literally in a room, like a studio room, not unlike this, but the floor shakes. You might hear the minaret going off very often.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of gunfire, a lot of bombs going up, and smells and all that stuff. And so you're put into the situation again.
Exposed to it.
Re-exposed. And now, though, you try to imagine a slightly different outcome or how you would manage onward. That's about reframing a situation. And so Stoicism is a little bit like reframing because it's cognitivist. It says if you're feeling anger, you're angry that. So and the other side of that is that this unjust thing happened that you could have controlled. And so you have to try to rephrase the scenario. Maybe it wasn't that situation that you could have controlled. Maybe the commander was in charge of the situation that you couldn't control. Rape victims,
right?
Whether they're military or not, rape victims. They blame themselves for being vulnerable to that situation. But maybe they were not at all blameworthy, and it was others that were responsible. So the rethinking of a situation that is the lead-on for an emotion is an ancient philosophy, whether it's Aristotle or Stoics, view of things. Now, is that taught? People that are, I would not say if you go to Walter Reed or any VA or a VA center, and I know people in San Francisco who are very active in the clinical side of soldier treatment, they do not work with Stoic thought. They're doing, what would be more familiar psychotherapy for us that has, again, to do with journal writing, one-on-one or group conversations about what happened and how you might reframe what happened, finding supports in supportive communities, whether it's canine help, care dogs. Those are a big part of therapy. One student I'm working with, a philosopher in the Midwest, he wants to be able to tell soldiers what it's really about, having had grievous injuries early on in Baghdad that really disabled him. That's what he feels committed to. So he wants the outreach of letting others who might be naive to what the potential injuries are. Is that Stoic? No. If anything, he's finally learning to let down his guard.
Yeah, whereas it seems like maybe the Stoic would, again, not tell him to stow it away, but in a sense to try and, I don't want to say pretend like it's not happening to you, but there's an element of
minimize.
Yeah, okay, that's the word for it then.
Yeah, minimize the impact of the external world.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can't. I can't even imagine how you would minimize the impact of the external world in a weather crisis, like this recent hurricane. Right. Here you don't have a home, you don't have cell service. Everything for 35 years is just washed away. Actually, I think reducing the enormity of the situation would be awful.
Yeah, it reminds me of, the stories that I've read, of philosophers being carted off to their deaths and thinking like, oh, this is fine because I've imagined how this is going to happen. Thinking like, how on the earth would you actually do that? And it sort of, I don't know, I'm skeptical of one's ability to minimize.
Well, if you think about Seneca, he's been thinking about death for a long time because you premeditate upon death. That's one of the kind of pre-rehearsals. If that's a bad that could happen to you, you premeditate it.
Yeah.
So there he is, in this wonderful painting by Rubens. He's in this large bath. He's sort of standing up, and his vein, and there are people around him. Sort of trying to imitate Socrates' death.
Yeah.
but the veins are all popping. The guy's tense.
Yeah.
This is not a calm, calm man.
Yeah. No, it's and I can see the appeal of it, I guess, when we talked about Jim Mattis, having Epictetus in his tote bag, right? Because it does seem like Stoicism would be very good for equipping you in a moment of crisis when you do need to be able to kind of get through it, right? So I wonder if people who are recovering from trauma, if maybe it's more of a useful tool for them after they've sort of had some initial recovery.
Yeah, that could be a way of thinking about it. And Mattis, it was actually Marcus Aurelius he was carrying
Marcus
around.
Aurelius, I'm sorry, yeah.
Because he was relating to him as a fellow military man. What's Marcus Aurelius doing? He's sort of thinking of all the people that gave him good advice, the grammarian that didn't scream at him when he committed howlers, for example, and others. And it could be after the fact. You're quite right. When you can kind of get your wits back. Yeah. Get your wits back. Yeah. And the Stoics did not. It is psychotherapy. That's what they call. They call it a therapy of the soul, and that's really the terms. Therapy is a Greek word, therapia, and the soul is psyche. So it is a therapy of the soul. And Cicero says you row your oars. You do dialectic.
Yeah.
We're a little bit more enlightened these days. I have to just say, as someone who's had psychotherapeutic training, I do not think a lot of people who call themselves coaches, under various titles, and tout some philosophies, are necessarily the best persons equipped to help you through crises.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of people selling wares.
Yeah,
because they love this stuff or they love the philosophy and
sort of aspiring gurus.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that, you mentioned Ryan Holiday. And there's somebody who, I think, he has obviously popularized Stoicism to a great degree. And I'm sure it's very helpful for some people. I've enjoyed reading some of his stuff and listening to his podcast. It does beg this question, though. I'm curious what you think of why is Stoicism so trendy right now?
Yeah, why is it having its moment? It's having its moment, I think, for about three reasons. People are tired of organized religion. It's expensive in some cases. It costs to belong. Secondly, it's very sectarian. It divides you up in a world. And there's, for many individuals I've interviewed, there's a bit of rebellion. They grew up with this. It had left its mark. It's not always a mark they love, and they're going to leave it behind. But it's familiar enough, and they can get it in bite-sized portions. They don't have to show up somewhere on Sunday morning, Saturday morning, be part of some group. They can kind of do it at their desk. Now, amongst tech brothers, where it's really hot, they are people with very big egos, a lot of Silicon Valley, like Dorsey, founder of Twitter, and I don't know if he was PayPal, the head of it. I don't think he was Mr. PayPal. But he was emulating Epictetus. I sometimes take ice baths in the morning, or I go to work without a jacket. And some Canadian interviewer said, "Well, sir, I beg to tell you, if you were in Toronto doing that, it's not like being in Palo Alto."
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're gonna freeze.
So some of it is you can tame. It's an operating system for people with big egos.
Okay.
That's one way of thinking that. Ferris, I think, put it away. It's sort of an operating system for many people that know a lot about power and need to rein it in on occasion.
Yeah, well, not to tamp down their ego so much as to sort of channel it, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, get it in a good place and contain it a bit.
And I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone who finds value of a particular philosophy, but are some of these people missing the point? Are they simplifying it too much and reducing it into just a little package of sayings that sort of guide you through life?
I think to some degree.
Yeah.
I'll give you a sense. My graduate students and some of my more senior undergraduates, they don't particularly like Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius.
Interesting.
They find it thin.
Oh, interesting.
They want a more systematic philosophy where they can really get into some depth. And, and so we have to work on texts and, and look at some of the Greek Stoics that are less accessible and that wouldn't make their way in. I think they're good-hearted people out there, very good-hearted people, but I don't always think that they're. You never know who's in the audience when you're doing a lecture online or a course online or something like that.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, too, that I think that we're living kind of in an age where if you go back to the Iraq War and the surge, and when David Petraeus, as a general who was also kind of a teacher, became very famous, and he was a counterinsurgency theorist. We're sort of living in an era of the warrior scholar, and I can see why these ideas of philosophy would be, appealing to them. But I don't want to overstate it either. I mean, is it the case? I mean, I don't want to suggest that, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that it's not as though like cadets are being drilled on Stoicism.
No, they're not at all. And someone like Petraeus is different. I mean, this is a guy with Princeton was it? Princeton education. I don't think Mattis is of the same intellectual breadth. I don't know him personally.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, and the whole notion of coin, needed a book, and Petraeus helped to write that book.
Yeah.
The military educators I know aren't necessarily into Stoicism. They're very worried about things like just war.
Yeah.
Just conduct and we'll call it asymmetric warfare. But, Michael Walzer currently wrote a piece in the New York Times about the cell phones going off in Beirut.
Oh, the pagers, yeah.
Yeah, the pagers. Yeah. And he, who's been a very careful observer of the current war in Gaza, and I have to say, someone who was known as a friend of Israel, said it was indiscriminate, it was unjust. So the issue of, I think, if you want to get philosophers in the business of war, it really is sorting out the mess of just conduct in just wars. Yeah. By just wars, I mean where the cause may be just, but how it's conducted is not at all just.
Right. And is that sort of how young people in the military are being schooled when it comes to ethics, to kind of bring it back to your first introduction to those cadets who were cheating?
More so. Yeah. There's, some of the individuals I know and some of my PhD students, that's what they've worked on, and they publish in that area, whether they're teaching at Army War College or at one of the academies. That's the sort of thing, because those are very knotty questions. Those are not questions of my conscience. Well, they are questions of my conscience, but they're questions about how, as a soldier in uniform, you either obey or don't obey the rules of engagement, because and you got to think them through, or maybe you're creating the rules of engagement, right?
Right.
These are very difficult questions if you're sent out into battle, and it may be only after the fact, and this is the horrible part, where you think that was not at all just.
Yeah.
And I'm living with its burden for most of my life now.
Right.
And that's really hard to see. I've seen it all too many times. You can write as many letters as you like to dead persons, or to the family of the dead persons whose stuff you pulled out of a wallet or something like that, and tell them, what happened at the time. And it doesn't necessarily clean the slate for you. Mm-hmm. But it's better than just keeping it stored without ever coming to, or tamping it down with alcohol. Yeah. There's lots of ways, there's lots of medicines to forget, and that I fear is just the worst.
Yeah. When we started the conversation, you talked about being a child of Vietnam and being on the other side of the soldiers. It sounds like so much of the work that you do is around helping people heal from war and these terrible wounds. I mean, is that surprising to you that you ended up in a field like this, or applying your knowledge this way?
To some degree.
Yeah.
Back to my dad, when he died in this area, in the greater Washington area, and I was the closest of daughters, I was cleaning up the effects from the hospital room. In his pocket were his dog tags.
Wow.
Attached to his keychain. He grew up in New York. He took what was called the Queen Mary at the time, the Queens, they called them. The warships were the Queens. They were re-outfitted as hospitals. And he went 14 times from probably the west side of New York to Scotland. And I opened that door with his keys many times, his home with my mother. I swear I never saw that dog tag.
Really?
When he died, I saw it. And so I think we had our own don't ask, don't tell policy.
Yeah, he didn't want to talk about it.
He didn't want to talk about it. I grew up with army blankets. If you've ever grown up with them, they're the itchy World War II army blankets.
It was green, thick wool.
Itchy.
Yeah.
But it was the extra blankets. It was the blankets we take to the shore. He was very good at getting splinters out. He wasn't trained as a doctor, but was really a corpsman.
Yeah.
I think when he started to open up a little bit. That's a very laconic generation.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a war that they could watch. He couldn't really watch footage of the wars that were going on during his the years of coming home.
Yeah.
It was. But I think he sort of, when he could rub shoulders a little bit with an admiral or a colonel, he thought, it's more than I rubbed in, when I was on the Queen Mary.
Yeah. Did you feel like a little bit like your father had served, and this is kind of like, you becoming involved with the military as a teacher and a lecturer was sort of a way to do that too?
Yeah. I definitely felt I had served.
Yeah.
I think it was very different if it had been 20 years earlier and I was still younger, and and the Vietnam War was, not so much in the rear view mirror as it is now.
Yeah.
Or, as it was in the 90s. One of the persons that came to the Naval Academy, this was quite a moving experience, Stoic or not, was a guy named Hugh Thompson. He was the warrant officer, chief warrant officer, helicopter pilot who saw My Lai. And he saw it, was then and wasn't sure what he saw, but he went to smoke. Or actually, the story is this: it was a quiet morning, and then he went to refuel, and went back to this area that we now know as My Lai, and he saw this ditch with squirming bodies, but he hadn't seen any enemy engagement earlier on, so it raised a lot of curiosity in his mind. And he was with two others, and in a backseater and another, and a gunner. And he said, "We're going to stop the helicopter. I'm going to get down. I'm only going to take my sidearm, and you cover for me." And they said, "Do you mean it?" And he said, "Yes, I mean it." So he gets down, and of course, who does he see but Callie, Lieutenant Callie, and Captain Medina? And he sees about 300 bodies squirming, and he sees them leading out more what appear to be civilians out of a hooch. And he goes up to them and says, "I'm an officer of the, these are officers. He's a chief warrant officer, so he's lower in rank." Mm-hmm. And he says, "You got to stop this, or I'm going to open fire." And then he told his guy, Larry Colburn, who was covering, he said, "If the GIs shoot me, shoot back." That's an order that doesn't go down well. It went down in history poorly. 30 years later, we brought him to the Naval Academy. He had never been really honored for stopping the My Lai massacre when he did. 300 deaths already, but it could have been a lot more because they were preparing for more. And, it was during Nixon's administration, and Callie was court-martialed but then got released.
Right.
And the military never recognized him. We brought him out because it was now 30 years later, and West Point hadn't brought him out, but I brought him out. And he gave a talk, and in the audience, some GIs from that period stood up and sort of felt like he was a traitor. And I got a lot of hate mail at the time. And then the person who thought he was a traitor went up to the stage in tears and said, "Welcome home, bro."
Wow.
It was a really moving moment. I brought him again to Georgetown to speak, and brought the local ROTC units to the audience. And again, it was he told me the story again of how he couldn't believe what was happening. He said, this isn't how we do it in America. I kept going through my conscience. Am I seeing what I'm seeing? Mm-hmm. Is it really what I'm seeing? And he told me as he was retelling the story, for the nth time, he said, Nancy, don't make me cry. And he was crying. He didn't, he died about the day before Stoic Warriors came out, and I was so brokenhearted that he couldn't see his story. But the ITV, the independent television network in Britain, had done a documentary that I would show to my classes routinely. Because if you think about it, I always have to ask my students, how old are you? When were you born?
Do you know about this thing I'm about to talk about? Yeah.
Do you know about Vietnam?
Yeah.
Do you know about a man named Hugh Thompson?
It's a moving story.
Yeah.
In the few minutes we have left, I want to ask
please.
you about something that's not, I think anyway, not related to Stoicism, but I read this on your bio and I was so intrigued with this, of work that you've done on dance and cadenced march.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that.
So, I am something of a dancer, just an amateur dancer. I've always liked modern dance. And at some point, I got asked by NYU School of Ballet and the Arts, or Ballet and the Humanities, to do a fellowship. And I didn't really know what to say. I said, okay, fine. And they had Edward Villela, who's a great ballet dancer, had gone to West Point to teach the cadets this or that because, he's a very muscular guy and they needed to know some of this stuff. So anyway, I thought, okay, why not? And so I wanted to think about ballet and dance and the military. And it turns out that the military has a balletic background. I kind of maybe knew this, maybe dance scholars know this, but Louis XIV was a dancer.
I didn't know
And
this.
he brought his ballet master out to the fields to teach them FSA, which is side facing with your sword, and but also how to march across, a palace floor without sideways. So, you face the majesty in the right way.
Yeah.
All of the etiquette that goes on in a court, how you bow, how you curtsy, all of that is balletic. And it comes from Louis XIV and the history of ballet, which was totally immersed with military exercises, whether they were on a horse or not, or just sword fencing. And, the sideway walk that's dancers, this whole kind of carriage. And also having a plastered face. You stare into, you kind of look through the sides of your eyes as to where your body is relative to other. Am I 2 feet from someone next to me or am I 3 feet? 2 inches or 3 inches? All that matters in dance. Because if you're partnering, you got to know where they are relative
run over
to
each
you.
other, yeah.
And you're shorter, they're taller, you got to have a longer step, or 4 across, 3 down, all that stuff. So I started thinking about that. And also emotional expression is what you see on a face, what you feel inside.
Yeah.
Do you fake it until you make it or not?
Yeah.
Or fake it until you hide it.
So did you choreograph a show?
No, I just gave a number of talks.
Yeah.
And it was great fun. I thought a book would come of it, but it hasn't. So I just wrote some papers.
It's so interesting now when I see, like people marching or those wonderful drills where they're flipping the guns and the rifles and tossing them into each other. I can see this now, the balletic movement. And I'll look at them like dancers now.
Yeah,
that's
Dancing with the Stars.
There you go. We have the military version.
Stars.
Dancing with the Stars, exactly.
The epaulets, the stars on the epaulets.
Exactly. Well, our tradition on Chatters, the very last question I ask you is I reach into the chatter box, which we have here.
Oh.
And I'm going to ask you a question that's been pre-written. I'm going to select it at random.
Okay.
This will probably have nothing to do with philosophy, just to warn you.
Okay,
So
but it's like opening the wonton.
Exactly. Here's a good one. What is your favorite foreign vacation spot?
Oh, very interesting. Okay, I can give you 2. One is Edinburgh because I lived in Edinburgh for 4 years. So Scotland's wonderful. It is a little dark, but for brighter times and more sun, Corsica.
Oh, okay.
One of my kids spent 3 years there, and it was a great place to visit. So French-speaking, sorta. Of course, it is kind of French, but
Do you get back
gorgeous.
there much? Do you get back there much?
We've been there 3 times, and we
Okay.
haven't gone since she's back.
Yeah.
And hasn't been there. You have to first get to Marseille and then take the boat.
Okay. But once you're there, you're there. And
You're
can
there.
kind
It's
of-
lovely.
You can unplug.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place.
That's great. Well, Nancy Sherman, thank you for coming on and talking to us about Stoicism, Stoic virtues, the complexity of it in the military, and sharing your knowledge and your stories. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
It's been great. Thank you so much, Shane Harris, for having me.
Great.
Love to do it again sometime.
That'd be great. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.